tell you a little bit more about myself. Having grown up in Montana, of course, it's just nothing but cattle and rocks up there, just about. So if you're a good rancher or you're into the tourist business and so on, a lot of jobs are waiting for you up there. Wonderful state, and I spent a lot of time there. Actually grew up right at the intersection of the Bighorn River and the Little Bighorn River. And of course, the Little Bighorn's famous for the battle that occurred just a few miles from there. After the battle, they built a fort, Fort Custer, in 1877, and it stood there till 1911, and then they tore it down, but they left everything. So we kids would go up there on our weekends, and between that and rock hounding around the Bighorn River, and we'd do a lot of archaeology. And we'd find all kinds of stuff because they never cleaned out any of the dumps. So we were finding all kinds of cavalry buttons and 7th Cavalry regalia and all kinds of stuff up there. Even found a human skull. We had to turn that into the state police. And but it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed those days. And like Rob said, we now live in the Seattle area. And what I'm primarily doing, give you a little bit of a background so you can understand where I'm coming from in our message tonight. Years ago, it occurred to me that we don't spend enough time teaching earth science to our kids. Earth science has been called the stepchild of the sciences. And one of the main reasons is that we maybe teach it 4th grade, maybe 8th grade. And meanwhile, we let the secularists control everything about it. They tell us what to believe and how to believe it. And this is the mold that our kids grow up in. And so when they get a little older and they start questioning things, they take off for college, there's a huge conflict, and it inevitably happens. They have learned all of their Bible stories through classes, maybe through Christian school, maybe through homeschool. There's an abundance of creation literature in the home today. There wasn't when I became a believer back in the early 70s. I knew of maybe 6 books back then. But today, I think every home has at least 20 or 30 of them by various authors in the whole creation movement. But the thing I found out was that kids are no better able to interpret the landforms and the geology around them than they were without the creation books. And so it tells me, although we're learning what I call the catechism of creation, we're not learning how to apply it. And that's a problem. And that's destroying, I believe it's destroying faith. So years ago, I've devoted myself to helping families and young kids learn geology and learn how to interpret the geology of our world. And so to date, I've written 24 textbooks. You see most of them in the room over there, all the way from pre-K through high school. Adults, I think, will benefit who don't have any kind of an earth science background. They'll benefit from these. But it's designed to build a worldview of earth history that is biblical and not just the Bible stories. So they take the Bible stories, but they learn the history and the geology that goes with it. And so that's what we're doing. My wife, Vicki, joins me on all of these things. She's an officer of our corporation, and without her, I'm not sure what I would do. She does everything. She does the editing on my books. So she's real sharp, and she does a lot of that kind of thing. So I wanted to present to you tonight a topic that almost got me fired in a Christian school. I taught Christian high school for a number of years. And one of my jobs was to get the kids through every verse of Scripture by the time they graduated. So obviously you start Genesis with the freshmen and then sophomores, juniors, and so on. So the freshmen, very first few days, they're going to challenge me and they're going to ask me questions that they're not going to ask their parents. And so there's immediately hands go up as we're reading. Mr. Nurre, Genesis doesn't say anything about the Ice Age, so what about that? And so I began to help them see how it could fit in to the biblical worldview. Well, there was obviously a lot of change, and I think a lot of light bulbs came on. They went home that night and shared the joy with their parents, And then the parents call the principal and demand that I be fired for teaching evolution. And so what it told me was that there is an awful lot of ignorance when it comes to understanding biblical Earth history. And so that's kind of my context for sharing some things with you. There may be some things in here that are somewhat technical. Most of it's designed to show how the idea of an ice age could fit the biblical model for Earth history. And so that's my whole context here. So let's look at some questions about an ice age, if you will. Number one, was there an ice age? And if so, how many were there? That question comes up quite often. Number two, does the idea of an ice age contradict the Bible? Obviously, if we're going to believe the secularist time frame of the ice age or ice ages, we as believers got a problem. And we're going to have to solve that, figure that out. What is an ice age? I don't know if anybody's ever defined that, but what is it? And then how would an ice age begin and end? Many of you probably don't know this, but this is really not a settled issue among secular geology today. They cannot figure out how an ice age would begin and how it would end. Most of us think cold. We just turn down the temperature a bit, we'll have an ice age. That's far from it. That doesn't begin to give you the mechanisms necessary for producing an ice age. So we're going to look at that. Now, this is Louis Agassiz. He's actually from Switzerland. He came over to the United States. He had a lot of experience noticing the different ice age features over in Europe. And when he came here, he began to notice a variety of those. And so he gave several talks, and this would be a brand new subject, of course. Most geologists of the time really had not really considered an ice age. Some of the scriptural geologists thought it was something related to the flood, the deposits and things that we were getting. So there wasn't a whole lot of discussion going on about an ice age. He's recognized today as the father of modern glaciology, and that's why there's so much French in glaciology. You study geology and you learn a lot of languages when you study geology. And the one that's least expected, of course, is French. But when you study glaciers, you're studying an awful lot of French. Well, in 1837, he is the first to propose in this country scientifically that the Earth had been subject to a past ice event. Now, and that's no mistake, this last couple of words here, keep that in mind. And as he spoke, this is the reaction. I want to read this to you. The audience listening was very critical. Some even opposed the new theory because it contradicted the established opinions on climatic history. Most contemporary scientists thought that the Earth had been gradually cooling down since its birth as a molten globe. Now, this is what I was taught as a kid, that the Earth began as a molten ball of lava and slowly cooled over millions of years, and then the first life came. Actually, volcanoes were really the crucible of creation, as National Geographic states. They gave birth to all the cyanobacteria and the precursors of us. Those were our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents back there. And but that's what they were thinking at the time. Now, if you had been sharp in the scripture, you would have noticed this right off. In 2 Peter chapter 3, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. So there we see the earth did not begin in a molten ball of lava. It began as a watery sphere. And the scriptures are just very, very clear about that. Anyway, he introduced these ideas. The Bible, by the way, is very, very clear. It addresses both the creation of the earth and a global flood. I am hard-pressed to find any kind of writings other than this group of, they were kind of peripheral people. They weren't paid much attention to, called scriptural geologists. But no one seemed to bring up the idea of a flood. during the 1800s. It was ignored and just not discussed as a possibility, even by geologists who still had a respect for God as the creator. They just totally left it out of the equation. And of course, this produces a real blindness. As a young child, I was taught that there were 4 primary ice ages, the last one starting about 2 million years ago and ending about 10,000 years ago. That's what I was taught. Today, they teach as many as 25 ice ages, or even more over the past several hundred million years. I want you to notice here, this flyer that I've got on the screen is for a movie that came out in 2012. I don't know if any of you saw this movie, called Ice Age. And I thought it was really peculiar because, of course, the big thing today is we're going to all burn up, and in this global warming crisis that we are having and continue to have, and that we're all going to disappear in a big ball of fire. Meanwhile, this was a hit movie that came out, Ice Age. And it reminded me of the 70s. Did any of you ever read the book, The Limits to Growth? Does that book ring a bell? It came out in the 70s. It was a blockbuster hit book. And it was predicting, of course, the end of the world. And it was done by the Club of Rome, this group of exclusive scientists who got together, scientists and philosophers, as a warning to the rest of the world that if we didn't watch our P's and Q's, we were going to freeze to death. The Earth was headed for a great ice age. And I just think it's very, very interesting how the tables have just kind of switched. You know, we're heading for a meltdown now. We're going to burn to death here. And you wonder, maybe in another 10, 12 years, we might get it right. So really, no global warming, according to this movie. It's an ice age. Now, here's one thing that Agassiz taught, and I think it's very telling. He talked about an ice event, not an ice age. And the idea of an ice age gives the impression of long ages of time, this event that lasted a long, long, long time. Whereas I think Agassiz's idea of an ice event, I think, is more in line with really what the scriptures teach. And so I thought it was interesting. He never called it an ice age, he called it an ice event. Well, this mystery here, the ice age, is a mystery in modern geology. There have been over 100 different explanations for an ice age. Not one is totally accepted. They can't get together on the mechanisms. Some emphasize this mechanism, some emphasize this mechanism, but they seem to miss the idea that you've got to have a combination of mechanisms in order to produce an ice event, a unique period in our Earth history. The Ice Age is one of the greatest mysteries in modern geology. In fact, it's in the upper 10 mysteries in modern geology. And they scratch their heads today. They really don't know. So I want to ask the question here, and a lot of believers will ask me this question: is there any real evidence for an ice age or an ice event? What's the evidence here? Well, if you look at the evidence that's been cataloged, it's primarily in the northern hemisphere and in the higher latitudes. For instance, like a lot of the Rocky Mountains, and your area in here is no exception. Washington, we have great, big, huge boulders that were undoubtedly moved by some kind of force other than water. Those are sitting in people's lawns all over the city of Seattle. And of course, it's in the northern hemisphere, isn't it? And the Cascades, all carved by ice. The estimated thickness of the ice sheets, and I think this is very, very interesting here. Whether this is true or not, I think it is telling. Secular geologists tell us that various locations in the northern hemisphere were covered by an awful lot of ice. You can see Toronto there was supposed to have been covered by 6,300 feet. Chicago, 2,700 feet. Boston, 3,600 feet. And Montreal, 9,900 feet. Now, I don't doubt these figures. I have been up in Yellowstone a number of years now. I've probably been there maybe 36 times. I've not seen it all, but the one thing is very, very clear. There was an awful lot of ice at one time that covered that. Geologists estimate that it was covered by as much as 3,500 feet of ice. And the massive amount of evidence would tell you that we had to have a lot of power in something other than water. And I'll go through that with you here. There's different things that happen versus water versus ice. In Colorado, these are, of course, this is kind of a map of the glacial deposits and remnants that have been mapped across the United States. And you can see in Colorado, primarily down through the Rockies there. Here's one good example, Glacier Gorge, Rocky Mountain National Park. You can see the gentle scoop in that valley. And that is a clear indication of a glacial or glacial occupation. Glaciers move, they build up a lot of snow at first. There's a lot of snow, and that snow compacts, turns to ice, and then of course gravity takes over and it begins to move. And typically starting in V-cut canyons or V-cut valleys, as they move, they scoop it out into these U-shaped valleys. And these are just so very, very clear. If you're coming with us to Rocky Mountain, one of your assignments will be to look for these and spot these. Here's one of my favorites in the Beartooth Mountains in Montana, just a few hours from where I grew up. This is a glacial trough. Notice this thing is there's probably 2,500 feet of ice that occupied this at one time. And then you can see how long it is. This was no doubt a V-cut canyon at first. There's a lot of evidence of water erosion up on top and here, and then the ice occupying the area. You can see the difference between this and a V-cut canyon. That is the canyon just at the mouth near Gardner, Montana, just north of Yellowstone, where an awful lot of water came through that area and carved out the landscape. That area now is known as Paradise Valley. If you're ever looking for a place to retire, Paradise Valley is the place. It lives up to every bit of its name. It's a beautiful place. But here is the difference between the V-cut canyon and the U-shaped valleys. And so this is big evidence for glacial movement. Here are some troughs in Britain, valleys or troughs in Britain and Alaska. Again, you can see the gentle slopes there. Another big piece of evidence is what we call glacial loess, L-O-E-S-S. This is fine wind-blown rock flour. It's really interesting stuff. It looks like this. It's very, very fine, and it's packed it down. It's not turned to rock or anything, but these are deposits throughout the Midwest. You can see the map down below there. It's kind of like what happened during the Dust Bowl. Very similar, except, and you were dealing with a lot of wind, you were dealing with a lot of loose soil that piled up very, very quickly. And I'll show you some other evidence of that. My mother-in-law's house was involved in this thing. And we have a very unique photograph of her house in the history of Kansas. It's listed in one of the textbooks. And it's a scary thing to see this. But some of the conditions after the ice would have melted, the snow would have melted, you get into a much colder, drier climate after this. You've got much the same conditions that would have existed in a Dust Bowl type atmosphere. It's one of the reasons why a lot of the woolly mammoths are covered and frozen in this muck, this glacial loess all across the northern hemisphere. So you can see Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, those are just huge loess formations. And it's not rock. This stuff peels off very, very easily. There's a picture of it. This is actually stuff that I have. Another piece of evidence of the ice age are things called erratics. Now, these are boulders that are in places where they should not be. A true glacial erratic is also not only a misplaced boulder, but a boulder that is not the same as the host rock in the area. So you're kind of dealing with quasi-erratics. We have a lot of these in Washington where you have these lava basalt boulders as big as houses that are in places they should not be. But the host rock is also lava. So in a sense, they're not true erratics. But something moved them, and it wasn't water. Here's a couple examples I give you here. Here's one we always like to see in Yellowstone. That is a granite boulder. Now, this is a true erratic. Yellowstone is entirely volcanic. And the closest mountains that are granitic are way up in the Beartooth Mountains, about 50, 55 miles away. And so the big question is, how did this boulder get there inside Yellowstone? Very, very interesting. Here's some more across the northeastern part of Yellowstone. Again, they are on top of volcanic rock. They're scattered all over the place up there. People just drive by, they're taking pictures of buffalo and stuff, you know, and just missing this. This is geology here, and you've got to have some answers for it. How do they fit? So if you look a little closer at the granite boulder there, you can see it in the foreground. There are the Beartooth Mountains in the background, over 50 miles away. So there's a real possibility that glacial movement took place and moved this granitic rock a long, long ways. In Washington, here's what we have. I was just out there last week. We have a geology camp we do out there along the Columbia River. Fantastic place to see real evidence of the flood, of the Missoula flood, and also of the Ice Age. Tons of evidence out there. But these boulders are in places they should not be, but they're all lava with the exception of the one down the lower right, which is granite. And the closest place for that is up in the Cascade Mountains. There's some granite up there. The Olympic Mountains are mostly metamorphic and sedimentary, so we don't get them from there. They've come from some other place. Interesting, huh? You just sit there. You have these all over the place. I've seen them here in Colorado, and maybe you've not noticed them, but when we go to Rocky Mountain National Park, hopefully we're gonna see those. Now, there is a type of quartzite. Quartzite is a very hard metamorphic rock, and it's not natural to Kansas. Kansas is primarily noted for its sedimentary rocks. And here in eastern Kansas, northeastern Kansas to be specific, all of this rock that has been deposited there is all quartzite. And it's the same kind of quartzite that came out of Canada and spread across Minneapolis or Minnesota and Wisconsin and so on. We call it Sioux quartzite, very pretty stuff, and polishes up very, very well. It's so hard. But this just should not be in northeastern Kansas. It's in the wrong place. And so really true erratics. Another kind of evidence we notice, these are a little tougher to see. You have to pay much closer attention to these, but glacial striations, these are grooves. When glaciers move, of course, it's a very heavy amount of ice and it's very hard, and it picks up fine stones, different size boulders, and it carries them across the surface like a sandpaper. And so when it does, it makes scratches in rocks that it moves across. We have them in Washington. There's some even in Ohio. Ohio is part of that whole blanketed area of ice. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Tetons? That's a beautiful place. Grand Tetons, I think, are just a textbook for not only glacial history, but also flood history. There's some very interesting stuff in the Tetons. But here they are, and highest mountain is Grand Teton at 13,000 feet. And these are what we call glacial horns. They're peaks that have actually been carved out by moving ice. So that's an awful lot of ice that at one time covered this. And the lake in the the foreground there, before I touch on getting ahead of myself here, there are also these things called cirques. Now, I know you have these, and you've probably seen these up in Rocky Mountain National Park. They're amphitheaters is what they are. They're just these bowls, half bowls, where glaciers have moved and carved those. Cirques, another big part of glacial activity. Glacial valleys, you see that one there. It's a difference between the cirque and the glacial valley. U-shaped and extends itself back up a canyon. The lake in the foreground is actually a glacial lake. It's where the glacier has moved and then stopped moving and melted. And this is what you have. You have the remnant of this. And one of the reasons why I believe we're looking at recent ice event, not one that's thousands and hundreds of thousands of years old. This is fairly fresh. Now you'll notice the kind of the green outline of the lake there. That's called a moraine. That's where the glaciers literally stopped. They do act like road graders, and they moved rocks ahead of them. And of course, when they stop and they begin to recede or they melt, they leave this ring called a moraine. Here's a much better picture, one of my favorite pictures in Lake Wallowa in northeastern Oregon. That is a glacial lake. In the foreground there, you can see the cirque, the glacial valley, and the glacial lake. Now notice the moraines on both the sides. These are side moraines, and the terminal moraines, which are in front of it. And then another clear indication of glacial movement is the hummocky surface. You see that in the foreground, pillows. There are a lot of explanations for how those could have come to be, but one of the explanations is, of course, glacial activity. And these places they're not extremely high in elevation, but they do indicate that something big took place here. It's like what Agassiz was pointing out. I do think it's very interesting. I like to make this note about Agassiz. He was one of the big thorns in Darwin's side. He hated Darwinism. He just thought it was a disgusting, revolting idea. And so I pay a little more attention to it and some of the things he has to say. Okay, so the evidence exists for a massive ice event in Earth history. So here's the real question we want to answer. The first question is this: how does an ice age fit into the Bible? How do we do it? In the Bible, we are given a very strict chronology. Now, the way you figure this, if you go to Genesis chapter 5, it's very easy. I've been working at this for over 40 years. And every time I read it and do the math, it comes up the same, exact same numbers. And those have been recorded for our edification. I think God did this to show us our place in history and to show us where our relation really is. I don't think it's a mistake that our culture today is fast crumbling because we've rejected all this stuff in Genesis. Everything it has to say is we've rejected it, and frankly, it's what's caused us to slip into darkness. But if you look at the chronology there in Genesis, of course, the first event was creation, and then about 1,600 years after that, according to the chronologies, Genesis 5, you have the flood. And then, of course, the major event, there's one major event we don't talk about here, primarily because it's a lot of history as opposed to geology, and that's really the creation of Israel. That fits in there. But then you've got Christ, and there's a lot of geology that was connected with Christ throughout the Scripture. And then you've got the present. So you have about 6,000 years of Earth history. Where are you going to put a 2 million year old ice age? Where are you going to put a 10,000-year-old ice age? It won't fit. So we've got to address this as believers. And I think the typical reaction is to be wishy-washy about it, or don't bring it up, it's too controversial. We don't want to offend people. You know, the list goes on and on and on and on. But yet this is our history. And this is what we use to decipher where we came from. The secularists weren't back there at that time. They didn't have anybody who was recording this stuff. So they're in the same ball game we are in, the philosophical retelling of the story. The one addition is we have Revelation, they don't. But if you look at this, the biblical chronology will not allow a 2-million-year-old ice age. And so we got to have to draw it out. And this is I want to give you this little framework here. You can use it to, to your advantage if you want to talk to people about it. I think it helps to have a picture. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think this does it. You have 4 major geological events in Earth history. The first one is creation. The last one out, I know some of you are going to get real particular. There is a last one and it's coming, but that's a whole different topic altogether. And secular geologists don't seem to be arguing with that one. They just let it go. So you have the creation, you have a pre-flood world. This one, there's not a whole lot of evidence for the pre-flood world, geological evidence, frankly, because it's all buried. I can take you to formations, one in particular in Montana called the Bridger Mountains, that is estimated by secularists to be over 20,000 feet thick of sedimentary rock, which is a waterborne rock. So I always tell people, look, if you want to dig down there, maybe in 4 or 5 miles you might find some evidence of the pre-flood world. But God's design, of course, was to wipe everything off of the earth that He created. So everything we're looking at around us is a remnant of the once beautiful earth. And we have just a faint glimpse of it as we look at the Rockies and so on, just a faint glimpse of it. But we're really looking at judgment of the flood here. And then you've got the flood, and that's really divided into 2 parts. You've got an inundation part where the water covered the earth, and then you've got a recessional part where the waters have to come off of the earth. And did they ever? We've got all kinds of evidence for that. But then there's this period that we call the post-flood period that you and I are in. That puts it in perspective, doesn't it? Instead of dealing with it way over here, trying to figure out our period of history. Are we in the postmodern? Are we in the, whatever it is? No, I just call it the post-flood period. It's a continuation of the history that began 6,000 years ago. So we've got the post-flood period, and this is where I put the Great Ice Event. It's somewhere in the post-flood period. Now, of course, the closer it gets to us, the more people started paying attention to features and things. So technically, we have to go back further than that, but we can't go any further than the end stages of the flood. Can't do it. Why is that? Well, the flood would have washed it all away. And this could be a real problem. So we're really looking at this ice event as the result of one global flood of Genesis, including volcanism, climate change, and localized catastrophes. Now, I know you're wondering, okay, wait a minute, how does a flood fit into this thing? How does it explain an ice event? Well, we'll look at that. First of all, I think we have to understand that the reason we have these 2 conflicting ideas of Earth history, and they are at war with each other. It's becoming more clear than ever before. I know of people who have been friends who cannot get jobs today because they embrace this stuff. You're not allowed to get jobs. Some of you remember the story of Robert Gentry. How many of you know that name, Robert Gentry? Yeah, some of you guys do. He's been all but forgotten here. I'm a friend of his, and I've talked with him at length about this stuff. He's still into the research on the radio halos. He's still considered today to be the expert in radio halos, and but he is not allowed to work. And so he and his son established their own research center, and they continue to do this. His book, by the way, if you want to read an incredible book about what happened, this whole adventure with him, it's in Creation's Tiny Mystery. And you can go on to his website, type in his name, and you can get a copy of that book. But it's very, very good evidence, and it's not been overturned since the 70s when he published it. But we have two conflicting sets of glasses or views in which we see the earth. The one is what we call supernaturalism, involving God and the scriptures. We have to include the scriptures. That's our historical framework. Without the scriptures, the evidence means nothing. You can make the evidence say whatever you want it to say. You've got to have a historical framework in which to put boundaries around the evidence. And that's what our scriptures do. It includes the global flood of Genesis. And then you have naturalism, involving only today's observable processes. It denies the global flood of Genesis and most of Genesis history. Consequently, all of its conclusions about Earth history are going to be affected by this view. And yet it's passed off as scientific fact. So when we look at Earth history, there are 4 words I think we can keep straight, even for all of us old codgers here. I think if we can go back and review, like, let's keep it simple for people. There are 4 words that I think if we can grab a hold of the definition, and this helps, by the way, this helps families. Because families are intimidated by this stuff. I mean, I got to learn all of this stuff to be an apologist for the faith. If you can learn 4 words, it'll help you a great deal. So here we go. One is science. It's that which is testable, repeatable, and observable. So with that, we might include chemical properties. Those are observable. When we study rocks, we study the mineral makeup of the rocks, is what we do. Then there's Earth history, not directly testable, and it's supported usually by eyewitnesses, written documents. And it does involve philosophy and interpretation. There are 2 other words I'd like you to add to this word, to this list. A third one could be philosophy, which is strict interpretation of the evidence. And then the 4th one is consensus. And an example of consensus is simply evolution. I'm told all the time, you're an idiot. Most scientists believe in evolution. How come you don't get on the bandwagon? Well, because it's consensus. It's agreed on, but it reminds me of raising my kids. My kids wanted to do something because every neighbor kid was doing it. And I said, no, that's what we call consensus. Otherwise it's known as peer influence. But I think sometimes we do this too with ours. So those 4 words, and we can just kind of keep track of those. What happens though is modern geology mixes science and history, and they call it earth science, and that is the big confusion. The same guys that gave us Bayer aspirin give us a 4.5 billion year old earth. And we can't sort that out a lot of times. But it can be a real problem. I want you to look at this table here. Anybody recognize this table? It's not a complete table, but it's what I can fit here. And it takes the top 5 historical events in Earth history. Notice the year of the world, 0 for the creation of the world before Christ, 4007. Now some of you might be tempted to say, well, I know who this is. This is Bishop Usher. No, I'll tell you right off, it's not. Some of you may have this encyclopedia, hopefully not this same edition, on your bookshelf. Encyclopedia Britannica, 1771. How many of you have that edition? You won't see this anywhere in Encyclopedia Britannica, but there you have it. It's there. And then on page 414, it has this little plate of Noah's Ark under the heading Deluge. The most memorable event, it says, was that called the Universal Deluge or Noah's Flood, which overflowed and destroyed the whole earth, and out of which only Noah and those with him in the ark escaped. They did not have a local flood view in Encyclopedia Britannica. They had a global flood view. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that has changed, and it was really brought about by this thing called the Enlightenment, beginning really in the full force in the 1700s. Modern geology has its beginning in the late 1700s. And what we have today is a direct result of the Enlightenment. It's a philosophical shift in Western culture not in science. For all practical purposes, God became irrelevant in the 1800s. And that's why you don't find any of these scientists bringing up ideas related to the flood. They still believe in God, but he's totally disconnected, not only from what they see in the earth, but totally disconnected from the scriptures. And we are living with the consequences of these decisions. We don't live in postmodernism times, we live in post-enlightenment times. And it's been devastating. The Enlightenment gave us the religion of deism. God created, but is not involved. He fixed natural laws to govern, and there are no miracles. Freedom from God, man was no longer subject to the myth of religion or the authority of the church and its Bible. And natural science became one and the same as science. This is a problem. It's when you study science, you want to be a pure scientist, you study what you can observe, test, and repeat. And the science that's being taught today is actually squelching young people from becoming scientists because they tell them what to believe and how to believe it. They don't let them frame ideas based around principles of solid science, and it's killing us, and we don't see it. Modern geology interprets all natural phenomena in light of these naturalistic assumptions. There is no God, or he doesn't matter, and everything began and continues naturalistically. So what are we dealing with here? We're really dealing with philosophy versus recorded history. That's the real struggle. And we need to be proud of our Bibles. Our Bibles are nothing to shy away from and be ashamed about. It's recorded history. It ought to stand the scrutiny accordingly. The problem is that modern science won't let us do the same thing. And we need to do that. So, now, long way around the barn, where does an ice age fit into the Bible? Now, if you put this on a diagram here, you've got the flood. And of course, Peter tells us the world then was destroyed by this flood. I would put the ice age immediately after the flood, and I'll get to the mechanisms here in a bit, lasting between 500 and 700 years with a rapid ice buildup and then a rapid ice melting. And I believe the mechanisms were really brought about by the flood for this. This is what we've got, okay? So, we're dealing with an ice age as an ice event, as a post-flood event, secondary event to the flood. The second question is, what would cause a great ice event? Well, the first critical geological event of the flood is this. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, you think he's getting a little bit particular here? All the fountains of the great deep burst open and the floodgates of the sky were open. Now, I don't know what's in your minds. I don't know what you ascribe to these passages here, but as a geologist, here's what I think. I think a lot of tectonic uplift, primarily vertical tectonic uplift, a lot of stuff coming up from below the earth. I think there is a lot of evidence for, I don't know if any of you are into these weird things called thunder eggs. Do we have anybody into thunder eggs in here? Oh, there you go. There's one wacko, maybe another wacko back here. They're beautiful spheres of lava. You cut them open, filled with lots and lots of colorful agate formations on the inside, quartz formations and so on. Where did that come from? Because none of the volcanoes are producing those today. And I think it's related to a lot of stuff that came up when the fountains of the great deep burst open. We can see a lot of stuff that would have happened as a result of that. So the geological implications for this one great big event are these. First of all, you got tremendous earth movement, heat, pressure. I think this is where our metamorphic rocks came from. As the chunks of the crust of the earth, which were most likely just granitic, as they began to move around and rub against each other. I'll get my kids to do this. Rub your hands together, feel the heat. Yeah, we feel the, what's that? Oh, it's called friction. Well, what do you think masses amount of rock are going to do rubbing against each other? And I think, personally, this is where I think metamorphic rocks really showed up. Cracks in the crust, you have a weakened earth. This explains today's earthquakes. They're not a judgment from God directly. They're as a result of a weakened earth. Extreme volcanism. Steam, warmer oceans, increased evaporations, ash clouds, cooler atmosphere, increased moisture in the form of snow and ice. If you add all of this stuff up together, you get a recipe for an ice event. You look at the bottom of the ocean floor, and you notice all of these cracks, bottom of the ocean floor. These were totally unknown, I believe, until around the 1950s when they began to chart the ocean bottom. But these really fit well with breaking up of the fountains of the Great Deep. In fact, if you go to Iceland, you get to walk through one of these big cracks. This is part of the Mid-Atlantic Rift. If you've ever been to Israel, how many of you have been to Israel and walked around the Salt Sea area? You go way, 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 way down in it. You know that's a rift that extends from Syria all the way over to Africa. And there's also volcanism at the top of the Salt Sea in the cities of Capernaum and Chorazin, as they've started to reconstruct everything. All the homes there that they've reconstructed from the New Testament are all basalt blocks. It's all lava that's erupted there. And so this thing is, you've got this Salt Sea, which, by the way, is never called the Dead Sea in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. It's called the Salt Sea. What tipped me off to this was when we were there walking around the area, took a hike around it, all of a sudden, you notice these resorts, really expensive resorts built around the Salt Sea. It stinks, and it's a horrible place. But these resorts have people coming from all over the world to be healed of a lot of different kinds of things. And the reason is because the Salt Sea is filled with all kinds of special minerals. And so the mud baths they take, and they sit in the salt water. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I think this is why the Bible doesn't call it the Dead Sea. It's the Salt Sea. It's always referred to as the Salt Sea in the Bible. But here are some cracks. This is all lava. And you can see there's Iceland up there, still together, by the way. Hasn't been split in half and moved apart. It's still there. And you can walk up part of the Great Mid-Atlantic Rift. Now, one of the things that volcanologists have noticed about volcanism toward the end of the flood, actually they wouldn't say end of the flood, they would say millions of years ago, probably around 40 to 50 million years ago, was that our volcanic eruptions have been not only decreasing in number, but decreasing in intensity. And they've charted these. This is just an incomplete list. But notice Wawa Springs in Utah. One of the amazing things, you drive up and down I-15, and you see some pretty amazing views, but there, Utah has 5 calderas. Now, calderas are massive volcanic craters that are evidence of huge eruptions in the past. And this is considered one of the largest at 1,320 cubic miles of volcanic material. If you've been to Yellowstone, we pay attention to the geysers and things, but the crater that holds most of the geyser activity in Yellowstone is just one eruption. That's the main crater. Supposed to be 640,000 years old. Well, of course, that can't be if our scriptures are true. So I connected up with shortly after the flood, especially as like Psalm, Psalm 142 verses 5 through 9, I believe. It talks about how the mountains rose at God's rebuke, the mountains rose, the valleys sank down. Indicates to me a lot of vertical tectonic activity, and probably would have produced a lot of major volcanism. If these had been a product of the flood, we just wouldn't see them. They would have been wiped away or buried under someplace in the ocean where we have what we call table mounts in the ocean. These are flat top volcanoes in the ocean. But these are on land here. And Yellowstone, its main crater is 45 miles long and 35 miles wide. Now that would have produced a huge amount of volcanic material, 900 cubic miles in just one eruption. You don't think that's not going to have an effect on our atmosphere? It would have a tremendous effect. Here's what I noticed. Being up in Washington, we live just a couple hours from Mount St. Helens. This was a big deal. No one had ever seen one of these things, you know. I think everybody is dead who might have seen Mount Lassen in the early 1900s. And so it gets overshadowed by what happened with Mount St. Helens. But notice little old Mount St. Helens produced 67 cubic miles in all of its eruptions together.
0.67.
Excuse me?
0.67.
0.67, I'm sorry, yeah, my eyes are going. Yeah, your eyes are no problem. 0.67 cubic miles of volcanic material. And so you can see the difference. The crater of Mount St. Helens is about 1 mile across. So compare that with the eruptions that have occurred before Mount St. Helens. We've got decreasing frequency and intensity of volcanoes. Now, some of the effects of these big eruptions, here's one in particular, Krakatoa, 1883. The comments about this volcanic eruption is that these acidic aerosols or ash clouds sufficiently blocked enough sunlight to drop the Earth's temperature by several degrees for a few years. Their presence in the atmosphere also created spectacular effects over 70% of the Earth's surface. One of the most significant volcanic eruptions, in fact it is called the most significant volcanic eruption in recorded history, is this one here, Mount Tambora in 1815. Now this one I had no idea about. I wasn't taught when we took geology, no one told me about this. It was kind of surprised me when I read an article, it was an old article back from the newspapers of this time. For some reason I was in 1816. I don't know what I was doing there, but here it is. Tambora erupted in 1815. This is the actual synopsis of that article. It erupted in 1815, killing 92,000 people. 1816 became the year without a summer. As the global climate effects were felt, aerosols from the Tambora eruption blocked out the sunlight, and that's a key. Blocked out the sunlight and reduced global temperatures by 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Europe missed the summer and India had crop failures. What was going on over here? June 4th, 1816, frosts were reported in Connecticut, and by the following day most of New England was gripped by the cold front. On June 6th, snow fell in New York. Conditions increased across much of Canada. 12 inches of snow were accumulated in Quebec City, up in Montreal. This is June. This is a pretty weird winter in the summer. But you can see some of the effects are related to volcanism. I think geologists are beginning to understand this a lot more. It says, during the year with no summer, many artists all over the world felt moved to write about it. Among those were Mary Shelley, who wrote the very well-known book, Frankenstein, to help portray the dismal feeling in 1816. I had no idea. Lord Byron wrote the poem Darkness in response to the weather. So that was just one major eruption. Now if you put some of these together, the ones that are usually grouped by geologists 40 to 50 million years ago are one of the Yellowstone eruptions fit into that. The Mammoth Lakes caldera system in California, Mount Mazama. So there were a significant number of volcanoes that were most likely erupting because of the tectonic activity going on as the waters of the flood were receding off of the earth and the mountains were raising. 200 million tons during this period of sulfur dioxide were shot up into the stratosphere. The sulfur dioxide prevented much sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, lowering the overall temperature and killing crops and many creatures as a result. One of the big things we see going on with the so-called ice age is lots and lots of extinction. When you think about it, there's no other animals equipped for a major ice event other than a woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros. And yet they were casualties of the ice event. And so that, I think, is related to something entirely different. I don't think they froze to death. I think there was something else going on. So if you review, if you put all of these activities together, you've got warmer oceans, which result in increased evaporation. Increased evaporation from going into cooler atmosphere brought on by the aerosols of volcanic eruptions, blocks out the sun's reflective energy, gives a cloud cover, prevents the sun from warming, and of course the warmer water into a cooler atmosphere comes back as lots and lots of snow. It's a very simple recipe, and one that I think is adequately explained by the global flood. It's some of the consequences. Although geologists, I mean, we might as well try. Secular geologists can't think of the things, they can't get it together. Over 100 different explanations. They can't put the pieces together to come up with how an ice event would even start. The flood and its volcanic consequences would provide the warm oceans, cloud cover, cooler atmosphere, and cooler continents to get a great ice event. Massive, numerous volcanic eruptions are the key. I think geologists are recognizing this more and more. I'm now collecting books on volcanology. I've got a bunch of them on my shelf, and as I read through these things, they're all from recent time periods in the last 10 years. And they're all recognizing the climatic effects of volcanism on the Earth's atmosphere. And I think they're going to put the piece together, but I don't know if they're going to, of course, credit it to the flood. I don't think anyway. They have to acknowledge a lot of other things if they did that too. After the ice event, of course, you'd have lots of climate change. Weather would have become much colder and drier as a result. Climate would have become much drier. Wind would have been much more severe due to changed weather. And we see lots of evidence of this fine rock flour that's heaped up all over the place. China is practically buried in it, called glacial dust. Dust would have been prevalent due to less foliage and drier conditions. It's very interesting. I've got several pictures in my books out here, one on the bedrock geology, picture of my mother-in-law's house, but a number of other pictures too showing machinery and buildings being buried in a matter of a few days. They'd never be able to find them. They're buried under all of this dust. And of course, very, very, very dry. So the biblical view then of the ice event, I think in summary here, is just simply one ice event caused by the Genesis flood and its volcanic catastrophism, lasting about 500 to 700 years between Noah and Moses. Meanwhile, I think God was concentrating on a few other things. He left this whole thing to us as curious onlookers. I think it just didn't fit. It was a part of the consequences of the flood. It didn't seem to have that much of a bearing on what he did with Israel, which was, of course, working with our Savior coming up and in a few thousand years. I think that's where he was concentrating. But this should give you some ideas in talking to people. Obviously, no one can prove or disprove because we don't really have a record of it. But it does fit within our biblical time frame and our biblical worldview. So, with that, if you want to open it up for questions, you can.
Let's have a round of applause. And if you have any questions, why don't you come up to this microphone to ask your question so that we can get it on the tape. So we'll take about, 15 minutes or so and have Q&A, and then we'll break for refreshments.
Question about the glacial valleys. They're U-shaped.
Yeah.
What is it about the glaciers that causes them to be U-shaped? Why couldn't they be box-shaped or V-shaped or some other shape entirely? Why that? And then the erratics have puzzled me. I mean, they're big, they're laying in fields, you think they've dropped out of they remain from the melted glaciers, but they don't always have evidence of them being pushed along. And if the big rocks were embedded in a glacier, how'd they get into the ice to begin with? Especially these really big ones.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could present some definitive answers to that, but I think we're guessing, just like the secularists do, only they don't admit it, but they're guessing. Glaciers, because of the incredible weight, water kind of takes on the shape of where it's flowing and digs a lot deeper, typically will form V shape. But ice is different. And whatever valley it fills, that ice is tremendously hard, and it begins to pluck out the rocks on the side, and as it moves, it smooths and rounds. So some of it's due to the incredible weight of the ice. As far as the erratics, they're the ones that I can tell the difference from the erratics, glacial erratics versus the water erratics. In the Okanagan country up in north central to northeastern Washington, there are parts of the Columbia River that are almost 1,000 feet high, the embankments. You've got this big Columbia River, it's a mighty Columbia River that flows down. And then there's a huge embankment that runs many, many, many miles there. It's nothing but loose silt and dust and dirt. There are boulders embedded in the embankment, not up at the top. There are some up on the top, but some of them are embedded, like somebody just threw them and they stuck in the embankment. And I think some of these are probably moved by water in place, but there is evidence in some of the flatter areas in Washington where the glaciers were that perhaps they picked up the boulders and moved them. And then as glaciers began to melt, they simply dropped them. Because the space between these boulders and the earth is not much at all. We have one picture we're going to be posting on our website here of a granite boulder there right alongside the road. It's huge, as big as the house. And it almost looks like it's just going to drop over onto the highway. There's really no soil holding it up. It's just stuck there. And it's kind of a comical photo. Everybody was trying to take pictures of them, you know, holding it up, this kind of thing. But some of these boulders they're just in the wrong places to be brought in by water. I think there would be more evidence, like we see on the sides of the embankment of the Columbia, just embedded there. But some of them, they're just sitting right on top of the soil. The farmers don't pay any attention to them. They just plant and plow around them, you know. And so in the middle of a wheat field, you get these huge boulders, big as houses, just sitting there. So I think we're probably looking at picking up and transporting and then melting and dropping is what I think is going on.
Just a comment. You could have, you know, mechanically, you could have boulders up on those sides of the hills, and then it gets kind of dug out beneath them, they roll down on top of the glacier, and then eventually drop through.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I know, again, I have to remind, when we're having these discussions, I always remind the kids, remember, this isn't science now. This is philosophy and history we're talking about. I think that helps clarify it. These boulders, though, as you look across, I mean, this embankment is almost straight up. and almost 1,000 feet. It's all loose silt and dust and dirt, obviously deposited by currents of water. And these boulders are huge. They're not little rocks, they're huge boulders that are just kind of stuck there. And they look like they're gonna fall down at any minute. I don't think that they rolled down from the top because of the cleavage of the embankment. I would think that would be, if you've got a gentle embankment, I would think that would be true, or could be true. But this is just weird when you see these. They're all up and down the Columbia, and not connected with the Missoula flood either. This is different.
You explained what happened, and I'm going to ask, what did it accomplish? Why do you think God introduced an ice age at that time?
Why did he induce?
Why did he introduce an ice age at that time? My God.
Boy, I don't know. That'll be a question of the century, wouldn't it? You know, I don't know. I look at it and I wonder, did he directly induce it? He did directly induce the flood, didn't he? I mean, he was directly involved, and he was directly involved in ending it. But there are some consequences that happen as a result of something else that are not a direct involvement of God, but that are a consequence. And I think, this is my worldview, but I look at a lot of things, that some of these things are very unfortunate because people are killed in the process, and people are, you know, they're not evil beings that were killed. Some of it just doesn't make sense. And I think the reason being is that it reminds us that we are all accountable to God. In fact, if you think about the flood event and its aftermath, there is no other event in all of biblical history, except the one to come, but we'll leave that out in those chapters there. But the flood is the only global event of judgment that I know anywhere in the scripture. You have Sodom and Gomorrah, but that's a localized event. It wasn't a global event. You've got other things mentioned. You've got big battles, things that are happening in Israel. They're localized events. The flood is the only global event that I can think of that is meant to tell us that we are all accountable to God. And I think it's one of the main reasons why the devil is focused on trying to eliminate geology and earth history from people's conscience. I think that's been one of the big attempts. Now it's my conspiracy theory for the night, you know. But I really think it plays a part in that, because if you can erase the flood from memory, there are no examples worldwide judgment of God. And so the flood is very, very important, and earth history in that regard, and the flood being the door, I mean, it's just kind of a hinge on which all of earth history really takes place, is very significant and important. And that's what I do with kids. I teach and things. I make sure that they understand the importance of the flood. This is not something you can just kind of brush away. So anyway, that's kind of that's what I look at it as.
Hi, it was a great presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Thing.
You mentioned that the woolly mammoths were buried probably during the Ice Age. I just wonder, was there enough time from when they came off the ark to repopulate those regions in order for them to be thousands present before the Ice Age hit?
There have been a lot of questions raised on that. Those are very good questions. If you guys want to, how many of you subscribe to the Journal of Creation? Do any of you subscribe to that magazine? How many of you do? Oh, you guys need to get that magazine, because it's very technical, and it has the top articles being written. It comes out 3 times a month. These are very technical articles, and they address these kinds of questions. And there are lots of studies, and particularly that one has been population statistics and so on. And I think Mount St. Helens is rapidly becoming a study for rapid colonization of biozones. And something's happened there that they never expected to happen at Mount St. Helens. Even after the first few days, they began to monitor things, and lo and behold, all of these spiders started rafting in, parachuting in on the webs and into the area. Tons of spiders. And they began to help create a natural biozone that then attracted other animals. And they began to populate, they began to bring, let their poops go with all kinds of seeds and everything else. Today, Mount St. Helens doesn't look the same as it did back in 1980. And I think that there's a rapid increase in colonization, recovery after the flood. I think two animals were different. We have to think differently about pre-flood animals. Most of these animals coming off of the ark, they were all pre-flood, or most of them were. But then as they began to populate, there are cases where some animals, we think their gestation period is this particular period, and they have one calf, or one, some of them have multiple births. And so I really think we're looking at a rapid increase, at least until the Tower of Babel, which was about 100 years after the flood, when man began to spread out. It was a 100 years advanced time period where animals that came off the ark would have been close to perfect animals. And you have to realize that some of these animals have been living for many, many, many years. And I think they would have been biologically possible, genetically fit to be populating have a rapid population. And there are studies that are being done on that currently. One of the magazines, that magazine I told you about, would be good to get, because you can look through their index, and you can look up online, you can get articles on the same sort of stuff. But I think we have to have a pre-flood mentality when we think of ability of animals. We're used to thinking, we see an animal today, and that's kind of our framework for judging what animals were like before the flood. And it's just, we've got to think differently. Otherwise, we slip into that thing called uniformitarianism. Present is the key to the past. It's not.
Yeah.
Have to think differently. So I don't know if that begins to.
You had two slides that basically talk about the Ice Age being overlaid on a timeline of the Bible, saying post-Noah, pre-Moses,
Yeah.
Genesis 10, and maybe the rest of Genesis. What do we see in Genesis that indicates it was cold during those times?
Well, there's one indication is that things moved rather rapidly to the southeast from the ark and into what we have called today the cradle of civilization. Civilization's pretty much focused from then on, from the advance of Egypt, right after the Tower of Babel, to Syria and so on. Those were all concentrating kind of in the midsection. There is evidence, by the way, it's not in the Bible, but there is evidence that the Sahara was once a tropical place, and that's in some of the artifacts they're finding deep inside of the Sahara. So for a period of time, I think it was true. I think the other indication, maybe I'm drawing too much from this, but you remember why Lot separated from Abraham and where he chose to go? You remember the description of Sodom and Gomorrah? He wanted the valley, didn't he? Why did he want the valley? It was lush and green. Have you been to where they think Sodom and Gomorrah was today in Israel? Have you been there? I wouldn't spend 2 days out there, given even the water I have. This place it's barren, and Israel is slowly recovering that whole place. Some of the things they have done with barren wastelands. If you ever get a chance to go and you stand at toward Mount Carmel and you look down the valley of Decision, and the city of Megiddo is right there, the excavated city. It opens up onto probably the most beautiful place I have ever seen. and it is lush and very, very nice. There was a period of time when that was all infested with malaria swamps, and Israel took it and made something out of it. It's really a gorgeous thing to see. So there's probably not direct inference in the scripture. Some of the other evidence of what has been called cavemen, like Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, I'm sure you get the idea. I mean, you could go on and on with these critters who were called cavemen. When I was a kid, one of the things that drew me away from the faith was I went to a wrestling match concerning Neanderthal and Adam and Eve. I wanted to believe both. I had science here and the Bible here. And my big question was, when did Neanderthal, because back then they taught Neanderthal as a missing link. So when did Neanderthal become Adam and Eve? No one in the church could give me an answer. They just said, just don't worry about it. And of course, to a rebellious junior high kid, that's not what you say. So that began my exodus. And it wasn't until a senior in college that I became a Christian. And it wasn't because I saw all this evidence, it's because the hand of God was on me, and I knew it. In fact, I used to go to bed at night kind of in a cold sweat. I knew if I died, that was it. And I had to get something straight. But I think what we're seeing, a lot of the evidence for these so-called cavemen seem to be related to the spread from the Tower of Babel to northern areas, particularly in Europe. And so when you put the pieces together, you wonder if what was going on is while people around Tower of Babel were looking for a scapegoat, an event this big, I am sure they were probably wondering, okay, who is the culprit here? We need to sacrifice this, whoever it is. I am guessing, this is my guess, that these people probably spread out and away from what was happening in the warmer areas of the world. That's just a guess, it's just a thought. I don't know if there's anything directly that would indicate, from the scriptures that would indicate that. You get a little bit, maybe from Job, where he witnessed cold and talking about it in relation to the power of God and so on. But one thing is certain, if you look at volcanic eruptions, and multiple volcanic eruptions, they do have an effect on our atmosphere. And so some of it is geological implication. This is what could have happened. And then you start piecing the puzzle together, and it does all harmonize and make sense. So I don't know if that answers your question. Long way around the barn, but there's no direct evidence in the scripture.
I had a question. One of your slides, if I recall correctly, gave the duration of the ice event, 500 to 700 years.
Yeah.
Could you help me understand what's the geologic evidence that gives you that range?
Well,
Can you repeat the question into the microphone?
yeah, I could repeat it. The 500 to 7 years, 500 to 7 year period that I listed in one of the slides, what's the geological evidence for that particular period type of framework? Let me just say up front that that's an idea. I mean, it's not, I don't think there's any hard science to it, but with that much volcanism going on, and you can imagine an eruption like Yellowstone combined with maybe a dozen other eruptions like it. Did you guys know that you have probably the largest volcanic eruption in Earth history in Colorado? How many of you knew that? Do you know what it's called?
Down at Creed.
La Garita, caldera. One of the largest, if not the largest volcanic eruption is Colorado, of all places. But if you take these volcanic eruptions and you multiply them and all of the stuff that's going into the air, it would have increased the rapidity of this kind of climatic activity. We can see what it does with Mount St. Helens and how it begins to, there was a little bit of an effect on our climate, on crops, things like this. But when you multiply that by huge volcanic eruptions, you just multiply the effects. And so we guess there probably would have been, as a result, rapid covering of the sun's reflective energy. And with the amount of water that would have come up from the breaking up of the fountains of the Great Deep that was warm, I'm guessing it would have been not hot like you're used to thinking of the 99 degree hot tub, but warm water definitely increases evaporation. And so all of that into an atmosphere gives a rapid, at least a rapid buildup. So if you want to play with the numbers, you can. Some of our boundaries are really determined by when did man start, as far as we can tell, start to record what was going on around him geologically. And so by the time that would have begun to happen, we probably would have seen much of the damage take place already. For instance, the Missoula flood that came through Washington. Are you all familiar with that? That flood, massive flood that where an ice dam broke, and it was a rapid cutout of features and canyons, very rapid. So we can play with that. That's a guess, 200 to 700 years, and there's a lot of factors involved in that. But I think what we see today are just simply the remnants of, you see it in canyons that have been cut by these floods, you see it in boulders that are left, you see it in some of the fossils that are buried different ways, you see it in water lines. If you go to Utah, Salt Lake City, and you can run along the Wasatch Mountains, you can trace all the water lines, and you can trace the entire area where the Bonneville flood, or Lake Bonneville was housed. So all of these factor into it, but I'm certainly not hard and fast in the 200 to 500 year period in there for rapid buildup.